a great measure for a conference. If you hear this buzz right after the coffee break, it means everybody is engaged in deep conversation, and that's why there's still the buzz and the conversation going on. We'll keep the conversation going. Welcome back from the coffee break. It's wonderful to have you here. And my worst fear has not realized, and I'm grateful for that. The room is still full. We have our audience with us, because you never know. It's the beginning of the week. It's a Monday, and you're all busy. And I was worried slightly after the coffee break, but it only attests to the success of the GRF and this forum that so many of you decided to stay for the panel discussion. And we're going to have an amazing lineup of speakers, which I'll soon announce. And we're now going to, in this part of the conference, we're going to unpack some of the big themes our speakers early on in the day outlined for us. So thank you again for being with us. Our first panel of the day will explore economic challenges in a post-pandemic world. It's titled Global Realities and Challenges of Economic Development. Our panelists are going to have a very difficult task ahead, but they're exactly the right minds, the best minds to address this question. They will seek answers to pressing questions such as how countries around the world can secure economic growth while addressing global vulnerabilities, such as rising inflation and geopolitical tensions. It's my pleasure now to first invite the moderator of this session, my friend and colleague, Feshane, who is the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg HT. He'll be moderating the session. I'll very quickly announce Açıl's guests, and then we'll have them all on the stage. His guests are Dr. Shomik Lal, Senior Advisor to the Chief Economist and Interim Director of Development Policy at the World Bank. He traveled a long way to attend this conference, and he's going to be a spectacular speaker despite the jet lag, because I've listened to him before. Welcome to Istanbul and to the conference, Shomik. Professor Ufuk Akçiğit from the University of Chicago, Department of Economics. As you all know, I happen to know him a little too well. Ufuk Akçiğit is also here. And Mr. Tayfun Bayazit, board member of GRF. Big applause, first panel of the day. The stage is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for us to be here, all of us. We are going to have a great panel today. The major headline that we are going to talk about is economy, of course. But as far as the economy is concerned, this panel is going to mostly focus on the recent report of World Bank Group, which is the World Development Report. And the headline of this report is the middle income trap, which many emerging countries face and have quite difficulties in order to solve that. The report brings out a lot of solutions, but it's not just a report, because the preparation process is unique and also made collaborations with all the bureaucrats from the emerging markets. They came together, convened, create ideas in order to give some strict and solid solutions to the problems that emerging markets face. So we have two architects of this report that we had. The first is Mr. Shomik Lal, and also the second one is Professor Ufuk Akçiğit, my dearest friend, and also we have Mr. Tayfun Bayazit, who is also the board member of GRF. So he's going to give some perspective about what we faced in Turkey in terms of finance problems and also the business minds that we have. So first of all, we will start with the presentation of Mr. Shomik Lal, but unfortunately, his schedule is too hectic. He has to fly back today, so we will start with his presentation, then we will have a Q&A session, and we will get your questions, if you have, to him, and afterwards we will say goodbye to him. Then we will have the presentation of Professor Akçiğit and Mr. Tayfun Beyazıt as well. And at the end, we will have another Q&A session. So the stage is yours, Mr. Shomiklal.
Thank you very much for having me here this morning. I do congratulate the GRS for its 15th anniversary, and I hope there's many more of these as in the future years. What I will do in the next 15 minutes is tell you a little bit about a report that the World Bank just released back in August. Can we put up the slides, please? This report is the World Development Report of the World Bank, and this is called the Middle Income Trap. The report is the 46th annual edition of the World Development Report, and this WDR is put in every year by the World Bank to shed light on one particular development topic. So the genesis of this report is very interesting. The genesis is that at the World Bank's board, the high-income countries were quite happy with the World Bank because they were talking about climate change. The low-income countries were quite happy with the World Bank because it was allocating more resources towards IDA. But the middle-income countries felt like middle children. They felt left out. At that time, they asked the World Bank and the management to have a report particularly focusing on the growth and economic challenges facing middle-income countries, and there are about 108 of these countries. So let me tell you the main messages of this report before I get into the details. The first is, these 108 middle-income countries are home to 75% of global population. That's 6 billion people. And the leaders of all these middle-income countries, and Turkey is an upper middle-income country, have one aim. It is to get their countries to high incomes and to become developed countries in the next 30, 40 years. Countries like India and China have goals that are very explicit. I believe Turkey has one too. And the idea is that they have set their countries in a race against time, that in the next 2 or 3 decades, they will transition from being middle-income countries to becoming developed economies. So in light of this aspiration, the realities are very different. What we find in the research we do is most countries get stuck. It's easy to enter middle incomes, but it's really hard to leave middle incomes. And that, let's call that, for the next 10 minutes, the middle income trap. And there have been many who have told governments around the world and businesses around the world on how to get beyond the middle income trap. But most of the advice has not really worked. The reason is, often most development advice is telling countries to do more of the same, that is, do more investment. Countries know how to do it, countries have done it, yet they do not grow. The other piece of advice is that countries should move quickly from investment to this word called innovation, and yet countries aren't ready to make that transition. So what we find is that countries need not one, but 2 very different transitions to go from middle incomes to high incomes. So in the first, it is to move from this investment-driven growth. Think about driving a car. If you're as old as me, you've driven a car in stick shift, and you keep driving a car in first gear, the car's going to burn out, right? The engine's going to burn up, you're not going to go faster. You need to move to the second gear, where you combine investment with a new term we have coined called infusion. And I think Turkey's doing a lot of that in some sectors. It is to take global ideas, globally salient ideas, and diffuse them in the local economy. When countries like Korea did it, they grew very well. And that's the first transition, is to do investment, from investment to investment and infusion. The next transition happens when you've done so well at infusion, you have to come up with innovation, because the gains of infusing more have pretty much tapered out. And then you need to combine investment, infusion, and innovation. And that's a 3I strategy. So if you're a low-income country, you follow 1I strategy of investment. If you're a middle-income country, you do a 2I strategy of investment and infusion. But if you are an upper middle-income country like Turkey, You do all three: investment, infusion, innovation. So that's a second message. The third message is that these gear shifts that you have to do are not automatic. They're not even easy. And here, for the first time, I think, at the World Bank, thanks to our collaborator, Professor Ufuk Akçiğit, we brought together these ideas of creative destruction. It's only when middle-income countries trigger the institutions for creative destruction are you likely to grow. And here lies the problem. It's a European problem. The problem in Europe, more generally, is that when you think about creative destruction, the forces of preservation that hold the status quo are very strong. Yet most of the policy work and the research work is obsessed about strengthening the forces of creation. But nobody's doing anything about preservation. In fact, in Europe, people like the status quo. And so those forces are very strong. And third is the power of destruction. And when Joseph Schumpeter came up with these ideas, and he's Austrian, he kind of talked about balancing these forces of creation, preservation, and destruction. And the Prime Minister, the Greek Prime Minister, made an important point about destruction linked to the energy transition. Right now, what's happening is that everyone in the G7 is telling middle-income countries like you guys in Turkey that you need to move from fossil fuels to renewables. That's how you're going to do decarbonize locally. We provide a very different tack to it. We say you should think like Kennedy. And Kennedy said, think not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So the analogy here is think not what your country can do to decarbonize itself, think what your country can do to decarbonize the world globally. And that's why these whole ideas about ISMIR and its link with the AGN, linking up to value chains in producing wind and other kinds of industrial structures becomes really important. So how can Turkey and other countries use the energy crisis as a moment to have creative destruction, to change existing orders and to bring new orders in place? Finally, the fourth point that we make in this report is that there are three broad policy areas that governments need to think about in enabling creative destruction. The first, and I think I mentioned that first given that it's Europe, is that we need to really discipline incumbents and market leaders. Those could be market leaders in society, in the economy. They could be market leaders in terms of technology. But remember, I use the word discipline, not change. Because often, as Ufuk's work itself has showed, and he's the first one empirically and analytically to show it, incumbents and market leaders are big drivers of change. You don't want to get them out of the market. You just need to feel them to feel the heat of competition. And when they feel the heat of competition, they're going to discipline, so they do the things that are good for the economy, not hold on and block off others from the economy. Second is countries need to do a lot more in rewarding merit. And the reason countries like America grew, and America, folks, if you don't remember, America was a middle-income country in the 1950s. And the reason countries like America grew is that they put in institutions that really started rewarding merit. So if you were in the 1950s in the United States of America, every doctor, or most doctors in America, were white men. Today, it's 50% women and people of different ethnicities. And the reason it's happened is that the US changed its policies to make sure the talent of women was rewarded. They had strong affirmative action policies. And finally, countries need to do a lot more in terms of capitalizing on crises. Today's energy crisis, I think, is an extremely important moment for countries to rethink how they manage economic structures. So I'm going to take about 6-7 more minutes and show you a few slides. So here is kind of the big idea from this report you need to think about, is how can countries move from these one-eye strategies of investment to two-eye of investment and infusion to three-eye, where you get innovation on board. And you have to balance these forces of preservation, creation, and destruction. And crises, I think, are our best bet to trigger destruction. but they are the strong preservation forces that are holding the status quo. And here I think the most notable person in this room who has made a difference to our thinking is Ufuk. Because Ufuk's work really, I think, is noteworthy because he made the point that the market leaders who can drive change are the same market leaders who can block change. So preservation is very difficult to look at unless you make good data and information available. Because on the face of it, a business that's growing may be protecting its market share and blocking competitors, or it may be growing because it's adding more value and innovating, and that's why it's justified in the way it's growing. So Ufuk is, I think, the intellectual giant in the room and in the field who has really helped shape our thinking on this. So here's a chart. It's a very depressing chart that tells you life in middle-income countries. And what we did, and what you see in front of you, is that the per capita income of middle-income countries on average relative to the United States is less than 10%. And if that's worrying today, it's never changed since 1950. No matter how much we think about convergence in the world and the developing economies catching up, the stark reality is whatever plans you have in the halls of government aren't seen in the marketplace. Life is pretty slow. You're driving in the slow lane if you're in a middle-income country. And the reason we use the United States here and not any other country is that there are only 25 million people in the world who live in countries that are richer than the United States. So if you want to catch up to the frontier, we're not doing really well. Now, over the last 2 decades, countries have not only stagnated, they are performing quite poorly. And this is a depressing chart. Turkey is doing well here, I have to say, that in our models, we say that Turkey would take about a dozen or odd years to get to about 25% of the United States. But think about countries like India and Indonesia. It would take them 75 years to get to a quarter of the United States. So far away from the aspirations of the leaders. And this simply shows, and the bars in red are Latin American countries whose investment rates and productivity are so low that they're moving away from the frontier. So they're in fact regressing away. So life in middle-income countries gets really tough if you do the same thing. And this model basically shows that if you were to follow the things you were doing in the last 20 years in terms of investment rates, in terms of human capital, in terms of policy environment, your futures are pretty slow. Now, here's the 3 facts that Ufuk and I came up with in working on the report on the middle-income trap. First is that growth in middle-income countries is slower, and middle-income countries are more likely to face growth slowdowns. Second, which I think is extremely important, is that growth in middle-income countries is different. And third, I think is a point that's been made today earlier, that growth in middle-income countries is harder, and that's the topic for this panel. So now, what we did very carefully is to look at every episode of growth slowdown that countries have had since the 1980s. And this is work done by Ufuk's PhD student. And in fact, what we see that if you're in a middle-income country, you're 3 times as likely to hit a slowdown compared to being in a high-income country. So this is fundamentally something keeping you in middle incomes and not letting you leave middle incomes, right? But it gets even more interesting that growth in middle-income countries is not only slower, it's different. So this chart is very telling because the bar in blue tells you that most middle-income countries have capital endowments that are almost 3/4 of the United States. Yet, the value added per worker is less than 1/4. So think about it. If you keep adding in more capital, you're getting less and less and less out of every dollar you put in, right? So the returns in terms of cents to the dollar keeps dropping the closer you are to kind of some frontier. And the reason is, and this is work that we did in the WDR, is that what really matters for middle-income countries is different. It's not enough to invest, you need to do something else. And what we have also seen is that for every country that's moved from about $3,000 per capita to $35,000 per capita, there's one thing that's common. They become more sophisticated in the products they trade in global markets. It's not only products they make at home, but products that trade in global markets. That's the one thing that matters. Now, and I think what's really a challenge is that the current economic fragmentation, the point Afshin made when she introduced the panel, is we are in an era where we're moving away from common rules in WTO to every country, especially the large G20 countries, putting in place distortionary industrial policies in guise of things like national security and in guise of things like climate action. And what it's doing is blocking middle-income countries from accessing global markets and global technologies. And after COVID, another point Afshin made in her remarks, debt is at an all-time high. So under all these difficult circumstances, what do middle-income countries need to focus on? And I'll just take 2 minutes and I'll skip over these examples, and these are in the slides, and I hope, Ufuk, you can speak to some of them. And here is what middle-income countries need to do. So first, they need to discipline incumbency. And what I mean by that is now, if you were to look at product market regulations, these are regulations that protect incumbents. If you're a market leader, you're somehow shielded from competition. And you see how middle-income countries, including Turkey, are pretty high in these distortionary protections. You need to back them down. Second, what we have seen that as an economy gets more complex, there are millions and millions of interlinked decisions you in business need to think about. The government doesn't have that kind of information to make those decisions, and the government doesn't have the kind of coordination ability to connect all of you for those decisions. Yet what we see in a large number of countries, including in Turkey, there's a huge presence of not only state-owned enterprises, but what we call businesses of the state. These are sort of minority shareholders in private business. They are somehow there as part of boards, and they're influencing what you in the private sector are going to do. And what this means, you're not able to take the risks you need to take to follow up on an idea on entrepreneurial creation. You're kind of within some very strict guardrails that kind of go with the tried and tested. So this really slows development. I'm going to end with one example, which I think is amazing. And this is my little understanding of Izmir. And in the Aegean, there's this incredible relationship that's happening where Izmir is becoming a poster child, I would say, of how Turkey is kind of embracing decarbonization. It's not about decarbonization at home, but it's enabling global decarbonization. These windmills that you see are only an image, right? But what Izmir is doing is producing generators, turbines, and other parts of the wind systems that most of them are exported. And they're exported largely to Europe to become part of supply chains of wind energy. Now, to me, a country that does that gets great technological capabilities. And because it's linked to global value chains, Turkish firms doing that are getting more and more sophisticated. This is a positive story, how Turkey is supporting global decarbonization, not in the way the G7 wants you to do, but the way you should do it. But there lies a problem, is right now what you see, even though countries like Turkey have capabilities in globally producing low-carbon value chains, on the right you see are large G20 countries putting in place distortionary industrial policy to block countries like yours from accessing these markets. EU Green Deal, the IRA, other programs by China and India, they're all doing that. So I guess if we really think in this conference about cooperation and multilateralism, the first thing for countries like Turkey is to see how do you get rid of these distortionary aspects of industrial policy and get the WTO rules back on track. So I'm going to end with, again, re-emphasizing that for middle-income countries who are in the slow lane and they want to get into the fast lane of growth and development of the people, they need to start rebalancing these forces of creation, preservation, and destruction. They need to weaken the forces of preservation, they need to enhance the forces of creation, and they need to use today's climate and energy crisis as a way to change existing economic and institutional structures. I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much for your nice presentation. I will have two questions as starters. First of all, politicians are always looking forward to catch growth as fast as they can. So when you say development and countries going towards welfare, how can you expect for countries like India or Indonesia, the politicians there, to get a mindset to reach there as fast as they can? Because you just say that you need a creative disruption. It's not easy to make some adaptations to your main policy and expect to go from here to there. So how can we expect from politicians that perspective?
That's a great question. So back in 1978, China had a visionary leader. His name was Deng Xiaoping. His principle for China, and that's a very centrally planned economy, was opening up and reform. Those are two things to be done at the same time. So at that time, China opened up to the rest of the world, but at the same time started doing local reforms to hold companies accountable. And around the world, countries have had different versions of that. Some don't open up and try to reform like Brazil did. It didn't work. Some open up but don't do reforms like Mexico. Didn't work. Those two things are complements. So what we have to see is that first thing is about opening up. Make all sectors and all parts of the economy contestable to the rest of the world. Because when you feel competition from others, from outside, there are two things that will happen. Your best firms and your best businesses will kind of pull themselves up and upgrade their technologies to meet global challenges. The rest, who can't do it, will leave the market, and their workers will be released to work in the more productive firms, and the capital will be reemployed. That's really important. And to me, that's the power of creative destruction, is to get more efficiency. Even a country like Chile, today facing Chinese competition, the best firms in Chile are improving their productivity, they're embodying new business processes, and the lower ones are leaving. This is something politicians don't like. The reason politicians don't like is that they like to hold the status quo. They are in the belief that small is beautiful, small firms are going to get us development, but what we find in this report and Ufuk's research documents, it's in fact high-growth firms that are instrumental in development. So I think it's this getting rid of some of these pet obsessions, right? I'll pick a national champion, I'll protect a small business, and I'll get growth. That's not going to happen. So I think competition from foreign shores is important, but also at the same time retracting support to specific sectors, to groups, and to individuals becomes important. I think but that takes political courage, but also takes information that's made available in the public domain so that all of you in business can question why some are getting favors and others not.
And the second question is going to be about the globalization and deglobalization, because in a globalized world where all trade treatments are working, as you just mentioned, WTO is working in order, it would have been easier for countries to save themselves from falling to middle-income trap and getting towards a higher-income country. But in a deglobalization environment, is it going to be a lot difficult or challenging to reach there? Because you just mentioned about growth declining all over the emerging markets, it's going to decline more if those treatments are not going to work properly.
So here's how I look at the evidence. So we see two views of this debate. One is that the world is getting fragmented into three groups. There's an American group, there's a Chinese group, and a non-aligned sort of group, right? And the American group has all these technologies. People want to kind of cluster up to the American side. And that leaves a lot of middle-income countries, not countries like yours, but smaller countries out of the game. There's another set of evidence that says that this hype or discussion about deglobalization is just that, hype. Because in the trade data, you don't see that. So deglobalization is seen everywhere, but in the trade data. What has changed is the nature of trade. It's not only manufacturing, but much more services. So there comes, what should countries do? We should think about structural transformation, get out of low productivity manufacturing, and try to improve the services component even in manufacturing, and get to be parts of global value chains. And there's research done by World Bank researchers, Aditya Mattu and his team, that shows that deep trade integration agreements, in fact, offset a lot of these concerns with deglobalization.
And of course, another question is a chicken and egg question as well. You just mentioned about the importance of sophistication in production for countries to resolve problems towards higher income. Do the countries save themselves from the middle income trap by getting more sophisticated, or more sophistication comes from the income when it goes up? It's a spiral, though.
Let me tell you this story. So in the 1970s, all the ideas, or most of the ideas in the world, were made in America. And everyone else was citing American ideas and doing their own. Now the world has changed. The world has changed such that the US has been supported now by Korea and other countries, and Asia has become more of the hub of global knowledge creation. There's some countries like India and China who have far more sophistication than their incomes would suggest. There's some like Qatar who have far less sophistication than what their incomes would suggest. The idea is not only to be an innovator in terms of products, but to make sure the businesses in your economy can start using that technology to make products that are valuable globally. So you could have the best science and technology, but if your businesses are stifled and good firms aren't able to grow, there's no advantage of that. So I think what you see is that for majority of countries, sophistication and incomes will go hand in hand. For countries where sophistication is very high relative to incomes, means there's something wrong in the business dynamism. For countries where incomes are very high relative to sophistication, it means they got lucky with oil or something else.
So now I will turn to the audience. If you have any questions, please. The microphone is coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Lazar Komanisco. I'm the Secretary General of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization. I'll pick up from what Mr. Lal was saying, that one of the main conclusions about the potential evolution from middle-income countries to high income, I understood that won't happen that soon.
Sorry?
So, from what you have said and what you have written there, you said that the bank says that crossing from the middle-income country status to high-income country status will take place not that soon, which means that the prospects
are grim.
I see them rather dire. Now, my question is, don't you think that it has also to do with the competition and the way and the rules on which the competition, globally speaking, is based? And shouldn't there be an effort towards improving the rules of competition, to make competition fair, and not to keep having competition rather as a kind of an instrument for control or domination by ones against the others. What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Great. I can take a few.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to go?
You can answer
Okay.
and then maybe
so-
short Q&A.
Right, so absolutely. Competition, the way I think about it, and we put in the report, competition of different types is all about contestability. Even if you're a large player in the market, you should feel the heat of the potential for others to get into your market. And often, market leaders, they have deals with governments that protect them in very narrow industrial segments. And that's the level, and so the playing field is never level. They get subsidized access to land, finance, credit, whatever. And what we see, everyone needs to have the same playing field to be able to compete, and that brings about contestability.
There's a lady here. And then the gentleman back.
Well, I'm Ana Palacio, former Senior Vice President General Counsel of the World Bank Group, and frankly, this yearly report is extremely important right now. Now, I'm going to ask you about something that hasn't been mentioned, and it is demographics. Because demographics count. The experience is that countries that left, and Spain is a case, Korea is a case, Ireland is a case, had at a certain moment the best balance between active population and dependent population, 2.5, about 2.5. Where is this in your report? Because today, the distortion about populations are there.
Great question. What we say that demographic transitions are such that a majority of many middle-income countries will become old before they go rich. And countries like China are already seeing it. And in fact, prime-age populations already moved on before they got rich. India seems to be a country which has the prime-age population right now for the next 20 years. So we do talk about the silver tsunami and what it means for the demographic transition in terms of labor force. In fact, now I heard from you, I'm going to send you a copy of the report in print, so thank you. Yeah.
There's a gentleman at the back. No, here, we have a gentleman here, then I can get to you.
Interesting. Now, I have a simple question, but a theoretical one. And you have informed us about how the countries developed and what are the ingredients that is needed. But then, if you include the industrial policies exercised by the major powers, China, United States, European, then the whole picture changes. And what would you like to comment on that a little bit further? Thank you.
So I think the first thing we say in the report is that all these policies that have been put in place of protecting domestic incumbents on the guise of non-economic rationale is going to be the death of global decarbonization, but will slow down growth in middle-income countries. The reason is right now most people don't appreciate the huge scale economies in low-carbon energy. So the more people do it, the cheaper it gets. And to block middle-income countries is a real great way of shooting yourself in the foot.
We have a lady.
Thank
And
you.
just the last two questions because
Thank
he has to leave.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Yasemin Bira-Kurtman. I'm also with the World Bank Global Environment Facility. Very interesting presentation, thank you. I had a question in the light of the opening statement by Prime Minister Papandreou what he said regarding the global political environment today. So how would you summarize and maybe reflect on the report in the context of what the Prime Minister mentioned today?
I think that's the point. The last 30 years, middle-income countries have grown in very favorable economic spaces. Now, the way I see it, middle-income countries are growing in shrinking spaces. So they need to start getting better at disciplining incumbents. They need to be better at rewarding merit because there are far fewer global forces that are helping their sales.
And a last question here, please.
Thank you very much. Taşkın Aksoy, GRF board member. Thank you very much for the presentation. Well, you were talking about the government intervention, and I guess you have some reservations for that. But by looking to South Korea's development model And how do you value of government introduction to industries like innovation and technology? For example, today in Turkey we have like the defense industry or like our car talk, for example. How do you value for that? Thank you very much.
Your example was South Korea?
Yeah.
Okay. So South Korea had a very interesting industrial policy in the 1970s because it encouraged large corporations to take on global products, but they had to compete in global markets for market share. If they did not hit export targets, all kinds of aid was being cut off. So they were facing global competition. Then, when the Asian financial crisis hit, Korea did something courageous. It took hold of those chaebols and disciplined them. Many of them went under, they were not bailed out. Names you have heard like Daewoo, all gone, right? And then South Korea had this new wave of innovation. And that innovation largely came from entrants, largely small firms who had new ideas. So in a way, so I was in South Korea last month, and they were saying we're waiting for the next crisis to lead the next wave of change. Thank you.
It's 1:45. We kept our promise.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Shomigwal, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. All right. Thank you.
Now we will go with our second panelist, Professor Ufuk Akçiğit. He's going to give us a little bit more from the report, and also he's going to point some perspectives towards Turkey and the transition of Turkey as well.
Thank you very much. Again, congratulations to GRF for the very successful 15 years. So what I will try to do today is, so I will try to reflect a little bit on the World Development Report, and especially with its applications to the Turkish case, and I will look at the Turkish numbers. As Shomik mentioned, Turkey has obviously a great potential for many reasons. So that's why, you know, we all expect the Turkish economy to do very well. But when we look at, for instance, some other success stories, relative to these other success stories, the Turkish performance over time is fluctuating around a certain ratio relative to the US level. So when you look at the Turkish GDP per capita relative to the US, it's typically fluctuating around 15%. And here I'm showing you some examples of Korea, Poland, China, which have been quite successful over time, and they have been growing. I think the main question that we should be asking ourselves is that, of course, Turkey is growing as well. So we are not saying that the Turkish economy is not growing, but we need to have a benchmark. What is a good number for the Turkish economy to grow? And I think a good comparison would be to ask if, when we go back in history and look at those success stories, when they were in the position of the Turkish economy, how fast were they growing? And when we ask that question, Korea, when it was 15% of the US GDP per capita, or China or Poland, they were growing at 9.4, 5.4, 4.8. When we look at the Greek economy, for instance, Greece, it was growing with 8.2%. The Turkish growth rate over the past 10 years have been barely close to 4%, basically. So that's why I think for Turkey to graduate from this middle income position, I think the performance of the Turkish economy has to be significantly better. And here, just to not crowd the slide, I didn't put a lot of countries, but if we add additional countries, there are many examples which were far below 15% relative to the US, and they managed to successfully advance over time. For instance, Portugal, Costa Rica, Chile, Lithuania, Latvia. There are many examples where those countries managed to break out of the middle income trap. So I think the main question that we should ask ourselves is that given that the Turkish economy over time is fluctuating around this 15% threshold, what is the main problem? Or how did the successful countries achieve this? So here, I've been repeating this argument for many, many years, and here I would like to give you a slightly different cut of the data. So let's look at those 3 successful cases that I've shown in the beginning. Poland, Korea, China, they are very, coming from different parts of the world. They are coming out of different regimes. For instance, Poland, it came out of a centralized regime, and then it transitioned into a market economy and successfully advanced over time. So in this graph, what I show is that on the horizontal axis, I show the income per capita relative to the US, and on the vertical axis, I plot the average productivity growth over 10 years. Okay, each dot represents the average productivity growth for 10 years, and then it shows the resulting GDP per capita relative to the US. So for instance, let's take Korea, the green line. Let's take Korea, the green line. And what we see is that first, there's a productivity growth. When you look at the vertical axis, in the case of Korea, there's a productivity growth. And when Korea initially grows, maybe it might be easier for me to move around a little bit. That's what I do in the classroom all the time. So first, there's a productivity growth. Then Korean economy starts moving forward. Okay, so this is income per capita relative to the US, and this is the productivity growth. Initially, there's a productivity growth, and it remains positive, and the country moves forward. Then we look at the case of China. In the case of China, again, we see productivity growth first. Productivity grows, and then income starts growing, and we know that the Chinese economy starts to slow down, and this is exactly the time when their productivity also slowed. So, if there are questions, of course, I'm happy to come back to the Chinese case. Look at the Polish case. And the Polish case is also a very interesting case because it was a very inefficient economy before the wall came down. There was a massive government presence, but they imposed hard budget constraint, unlike East Germany. East Germany was very concerned about unemployment, and they were trying to save all those firms and try to make them survive. Whereas Polish economy imposed hard budget constraint on their former SOEs, and as a result, they paid the bill in the short run, but thanks to the selection and the competitive environment they created, there has been productivity growth, and then their income starts growing as well. So where does the Turkish economy stand? Let me plot the Turkish economy over time. This is the Turkish economy. So it looks like a signature, unfortunately, and so I've been repeating this, and I'm really trying to slice the data many different ways until it resonates. There are no success stories in the world. There are no success stories in the world where an economy managed to grow without productivity growth. In the short run, it can happen. The solo model, indeed, the very first path-breaking growth model was saying that in the short run, you can grow through capital accumulation. But if you want to generate sustainable growth in the long run, you need to grow through productivity. And that's why I think, Açıl Bey's question was right spot on. Of course, policymakers are after quick growth episodes, and that's feasible. Indeed, there are many examples. You can very heavily subsidize the industry, and then, if you subsidize industry, of course, if you subsidize firms in terms of their wage bill, they are going to hire more people. The economy will create more jobs. But that's not going to be an organic growth. That's going to be a forced growth. And that's exactly what is the short-lived, short-run growth. If you want to generate long-term, high-quality growth, the only way it can happen is through improving the productivity. And without understanding this problem, and without doing the homework to improve the productivity, we cannot generate a sustainable long-run growth.
Ufuk, I would like to interrupt you with a great news, which is an urgent news that has just spread it right now. We have a Nobel winner Turkish economist now. Daron Acemoğlu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson were awarded the Nobel Prize this year. Well deserved, right?
Well, I'm speechless right now. Now I'm shaking, literally. I don't think, I think we need to talk about Daron now. I mean, he's been, oh my goodness, this is a very emotional moment, actually. I think it's an extremely well-deserved. We have an incredible success story in front of us. And I feel extremely lucky to have witnessed, to have been around him, to have been guided by him. We were just at dinner 2 nights ago at Philly's restaurant. Oh my goodness, this is incredible.
I was fortunate enough to be with him yesterday in another meeting. and he has you have to feel happy that he has quoted you twice in his graphics. So you were quoted by a Nobel Prize winner, so you can continue with pride.
I owe him a lot, but first of all, he's an amazing human being, right? He's an amazing human being, such a humble person, and I think this is going to be a historical moment for the Turkish economy as well. I think many things hopefully will change after this amazing news. It's incredible.
Sorry to interrupt, but it worked, right?
No, it was totally worth it. Yes. I don't know how I can continue after this, but okay, let me try to somehow do my job. But huge congratulations to Daron Hoca. It's incredible. It's really incredible. Wow. Okay, now, so this productivity, this signature has to change. Okay, this signature has to change. And I think we need to focus on this important problem that we are facing. Now, when we go back in history, so we've been talking about the Korean success story for a long time. Indeed, when we go back in history, the Turkish economy started in 1923, and the Korean history started in 1960 in terms of the market economy. And the first 15 years of the Korean economy and the Turkish economy look very, very similar. Indeed, both economies managed to grow 2 or 3 times during that first 15 years. And when you look at what they've done, they've followed very similar path in the beginning. So first, they invested significantly in infrastructure. They invested very significantly in education. And indeed, Shomik was very fast in his example, but in the case of Korea, there has been a lot of Japanese influence. They sent their scientists to Japan to learn. Of course, there was also a lot of the US influence in the Korean case. There was a lot of knowledge flow into the country. And when we look at the Turkish case, for instance, the Istanbul University's history, when it was founded, 50% of its professors was foreigners. There was a lot of knowledge inflow in the beginning. So that's why, when we look at the Korean case in terms of the infrastructure into railroads and roads, education, it looks very similar. But there was a question about the Korean economy. Korean economy managed to transition into the market economy successfully. And I think on those dimensions, the indicators are not looking very promising. So when we look at the innovation indicators or technology indicators, be it R&D to GDP ratio, high-tech share in exports, scientific publication per capita, or what Shomik mentioned, the complexity of the production. In all these indicators, unfortunately, we are not scoring very well among the OECD countries. So Shomik mentioned that there has to be 3 phases of growth. This very first phase, the investment phase, can be achieved through centralized economies, in the sense that, strong government involvement in terms of investment into infrastructure can generate some growth. But once you enter into the second phase, now market forces need to be unleashed. And there has to be decentralization and smart deregulation. And in those indicators, unfortunately, as Shomik also mentioned in his presentation, in terms of the SOE presence, both directly and indirectly, or in terms of the regulations, unfortunately, Turkish economy falls behind the OECD average. And here, normally it doesn't matter whether it's labeled SOEs or it's labeled as large firm or small firm. It doesn't matter as long as those entities are generating productivity in the economy. But when we look at the data, unfortunately, SOEs do not grow in terms of their productivity relative to the private firms. So in a recent analysis, we compared SOEs and non-SOEs in Turkey. And when I talk about SOEs, these are not just direct ownership. There are also indirect ownership. For instance, if a direct SOE owns a share of another company, we also label that owned company is also part of the SOE business group. And when we look at them, in terms of the productivity growth, unfortunately, SOEs do not generate positive productivity growth in general. Second, when we look at SOE presence in a market, when we split the markets as those where there are significant SOE presence versus not significant SOE presence, market concentration is significantly higher in those industries where there is significant SOE presence. So the competition, those competitive forces, the market forces, are not in action as strongly. And when we look at this third graph, which I think is particularly important, is telling us that when SOEs enter into a market, private firms slow down their R&D investment. So in the previous graph, I showed that the Turkish firms are not investing in R&D as much. But when we look, for instance, at this graph, one of the potential problems is also this SOE presence somehow not crowding in, but crowding out R&D investment by private firms. And again, there was a question, yes, in the beginning of all these economic stories, there is some government intervention initially, but those are successful if they manage to crowd in private R&D investment, not crowd out. Whereas what we see here is a crowding out of R&D investment. So we talked about regulations, and yes, Turkish economy is above average regulated economy. So we need to revisit those regulations. And some regulations are needed, of course, but whenever a regulation is not working well, we should abolish those regulations. And here is one example, for instance. There's a regulation in the Turkish economy which says that if you're employing more than 50 workers in your company, then you're subject to additional restrictions or additional regulations. Now, I'm showing you here the productivity distribution of firms, labor productivity distribution of firms. This is size, how many workers they are hiring, and this is the labor productivity of those firms. Normally, more productive firms should be larger on average. What we see here is that the most productive firms in the Turkish economy are the ones that are hiring or employing 48 or 49 workers, not 51, 52, 53. Something is really odd here. Clearly, here the numbers do not necessarily reflect the labor productivity. Here, the firms are relying on production using informal workers. So as a result, when you calculate the output relative to the formal workers, the denominator is not registered well. As a result, these type of regulations are triggering informality. And as a result, when you do a formal analysis of the implication of such regulation, whenever you have a regulation that kicks in the way I described, it will trigger informality. So if we are talking about a market-based high productive firms or high productive economy, we need to take the informality aspect or these type of regulations implications into account as well. Now, we talked about the creative destruction repeatedly, but for creative destruction to take place, new entrepreneurs need to exercise their ideas so that they can replace the unproductive incumbents and there can be turnover. But when we look at, for instance, business indicators, and here is one survey that was conducted by Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, percentage of the population who see good opportunities to start a business, unfortunately, the Turkish economy doesn't seem to be on top of the list. Again, when we look at the productivity dynamics, again, I mentioned in the beginning that the productivity is the key here. When we look at the productivity comparison of new entrants versus incumbents, in a healthy economy, new entrants should be more productive and replace the unproductive firms, and there has to be a turnover. Whereas when we look at the Turkish economy here, unfortunately, we see that the entrants are less productive than exiters, whereas exactly the opposite should be happening. Now, again, whenever we have students graduating from school, we are trying to force them into either business track, or they can say, I don't want to necessarily make a career in business, I want to make an academic career. They are choosing between the two. As I showed you, in terms of the high-tech production, the country is not necessarily paying high salary to technical workers because the production is not rewarding high-tech skilled people. So as a result, the business track doesn't seem to be very promising for very well, technically trained people. Then what about the academic track in that case? Can they become scientists, for instance, if they have the ambition and become a scientist in Turkey? So this is the academic freedom index among OECD countries. Again, it's not the data that we produce. This is just the external data sources. Probably, this is also preventing people from, thinking into going into academic environment. And when we look at the compensations in academia, the starting salaries are, at least in economics, since I know the economic salary is much better, the difference is 10 times in the US relative to the Turkish case. So as a result, when somebody wants to go the academic route, in that case, they are not going to do it. At least they are not going to do it in Turkey. And as a result, when we look at the fraction of people who have master's or PhD degrees in the population, we are falling quite significantly behind. So as a result, when we have these young people who are deciding between academic track or whether they should go into a high-tech sector and get good salaries, we are blocking them in both ways. So as a result, it creates a brain drain in the country. And when brain drain happens, unfortunately, we are not losing the average person in the country. So this is showing the brain drain numbers over time, at least in health, that we calculated in the data. Starting from 2016, there's a massive outflow. And when we look at the people's productivity in terms of who is leaving the country, so these are the Turkish scientists who used to reside in Turkey, and we group them by their productivity and ask what is the likelihood of them leaving the country. So what we see here is that those people who are leaving the country are the highest productive people, right? The highest productivity people. Now we might say, well, if we are losing the highest productivity people, maybe we are attracting highest productivity people from outside. Now I'm going to ask exactly the same question for return migration. Which people are coming back? The answer is here. So when we group the Turkish scientists abroad by their productivity and ask who are coming back, unfortunately the picture flips completely in the opposite direction. So we are losing the best and we are attracting, unfortunately, not the most productive one. Of course, there are exceptions. So I'm not saying that this should apply to everybody, but in terms of the policies we have, unfortunately, the average trend is going in the opposite direction. And this is the final graph that I would like to show. Now, here we are comparing different people to different people. But what if I compare the same person when the same person is in the country versus outside the country? I'm going to look at the same person and see the change within the person. When I look at person who moves abroad at time 0, the same person, after moving abroad, the productivity increases by 30%. After leaving the borders of the country, they become 30% more productive. And when I look at the return migrants, when they come back, their productivity decreases by 10%. So it's the same person, but performs completely differently depending on which borders they are in. So here I would like to stop and
Thank you.
Just my one final concluding word. So again, the country no doubt has huge potential, but first we need to really understand what are the top priorities. Of course, I'm realistic. Inflation is the #1 problem right now. I'm not saying that we should just leave all other problems aside and focus on productivity. But we have different entities to focus on different things. For instance, we have different agencies to focus on higher education, and industrial policy and monetary policy. So yes, inflation is the #1 problem, but we should never forget the importance of the productivity problem, which we have been ignoring for many decades. And I think the World Development Report is offering important messages. I hope we can all continue with this discussion in the country around the WDR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will proceed to Mr. Tayfun Beyazıt for his remarks, and then we will make the Q&A.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, I would also like to congratulate Daron. As I said, yesterday I was in another meeting. Was happy and honored to listen to him. As I repeated, he made reference to your studies, which are very useful, very guiding. Pretty much his message there also was in line with what we have discussed today. So I think maybe I can, in a couple sentences, summarize from the business world perspective. Then I'm sure there will be a lot of questions that Ufuk especially would like to answer, give answers to. Obviously that we have a productivity problem, a serious productivity problem, and we know now the root causes of those problems. We definitely need to improve our educational system in the factors of academic freedom, other freedom, rule of law. There are a number of things which I think in the recent years are labeled as structural reforms. Probably, summarizing them under one heading had not been so useful in terms of what really mean by that. So it became a bit empty concept. But under that, as Professor Akçiğit very properly outlined, there are a number of things that we need to do in order to reverse the negative trends that we are in. Otherwise, we will not be able to improve our growth. As you have shown, the graphics definitely show our relative growth, especially in the last decade, is negative. And a decade before, where we think we were most successful, we thought that we were converging with Europe, we have done the major reforms, etc. It's near to zero, relatively. So we really have to think seriously what our productivity problems are stemming from and address probably quick winners first. Because if we keep on discussing these with a very medium and large term perspective, we cannot get the decision makers interested in implementing those reforms. So we probably have to have a more comprehensive reform with probably a focus on short-term ideas to start with. So I think this is what I see. It has also been highlighted in the report, and also you have mentioned that the public sector, private sector difference, and the use and efficiency that we can derive with collaboration between these two, rather than one dominating it. You used very properly the word crowding in, which is something that we are seeing in quite a number of sectors. Either the public sector being a major player or a major regulator, which is preventing growth in some of the sectors that we are in. So here the proper balance between private sector and public sector will have to be addressed, I think. We will have to be proud of our organic and real productive growth rather than just growth numbers, as we have seen in the previous years. So I think this transformation requires real dedication, trying to include most of the segments of the public, including business, labor, all segments of regulators, decision makers, politicians, whatever. So without really including all the players in the economy, this cannot be successful. That is, other than that, I will not go into detail. We have still problems in gender equality, in technology, what we need to do in the infrastructure, innovation, responsible production, etc. But I think these are all details. We just will have to focus to understand that we are in at a stage where we will have to think out of the box much differently than what we had thought before. And I think the business world is ready to do that. Otherwise, we will continue to discuss why we cannot beat inflation, whether we can just address that with the interest rates. I'm sure we are doing a lot in terms of the monetary policy, etc. But the picture is much larger than that, as far as I see it. So I will summarize as such.
Okay, thank you very much for your remarks. And now we will go to the question and answer session. We will take 4 or 5 questions. So let's start with the gentleman back. We cannot hear. Yeah, can you try again?
Done?
Yeah.
Okay, now it's done. First of all, congratulations to Daron Acemoğlu. It's really, quite a success. Ufuk, I have a question for you. I was asked by TÜSİAD many years ago to do a report on the informal economy. And when I look at that report and where we are today, I am, unfortunately, we haven't really moved very far. And it seems to me that in your analysis, when you look at how countries move to a high productive path to get out of the income trap, the role of the informal economy is extremely important. That is, in our experience, in Turkey at least, that is really the most insidious factor that has prevented us from moving along that path. Because all the others regarding to policy framework, they can be managed and addressed. But the informal economy part, we have been utterly unsuccessful. For 2 reasons, it seems to me. One, basically electoral politics. Governments shy away from addressing that for fear of losing popularity and creating unemployment. And the second one is the path dependency. Namely, we start from a level where already the informal economy, the share of the informal economy is very high, as opposed to other countries possibly which started at a level where their share of the informal economy was low, so they can move along that path more rapidly. So the politics of addressing the informal economy, we failed. What would your recommendations, based on what you've learned through this very studious exercise, about how we can actually move the needle on that one? Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question. So first, my take on this is that informal sector is not the cause. It's the result. It's the reflection on the mirror, basically. So if we had managed to create high value-added sectors, high value-added companies that offer high-paying jobs, the informal sector will automatically vanish. And when companies are competing on this really low margins, return margins, and they are not wiped out by productive firms, as a result, they try to rely on any margin where they can somehow survive in the market, and this encourages informality. So first, of course, the checks and balances and the regulations, they have to be there, but you cannot really fight with informality by hitting on its head. Informality should organically vanish if we can create a healthy, successful, high-tech sector, and people will automatically, in that case, leave the informality. Otherwise, people are trying to survive in the market, and since the margins, the profit margins are so slim, they are trying to rely on all sorts of course, there are some other geopolitical reasons at the moment, but we should leave that aside. So for longer-term solution, I think the main solution there is exactly what I tried to highlight in the beginning. It's about turning the productivity engine on and creating high value-added sectors and high value-added firms. That should be the solution.
Any other questions? Yeah. You can use the microphone.
Oh, thank you. Selçuk Esenbel, Asian Studies Center, Boğaziçi University. I have a question for Professor Akçiğit, because you mentioned, Korea in your graphs. Now, what about the role of foreign capital as instrumental in technology transfer? Because, Japan benefited from British and German technology before 1945 with technology transfer, and in the 50s and 60s, American technology. And of course, Korea after 1964 benefited from Japanese technology transfer throughout the 70s. So what has been and what should be the role of not foreign investment simply into, shall we say, the stock market, but what I mean is technology transfer, capability of, making an agreement with technology uplifting of Turkish economy. Thank you.
Maybe I can also add the infusion part that Turkey is lacking towards that question.
Absolutely. So that's an absolutely very vital question. So we need to understand this theory that was laid out by the WDR very clearly. So the model says that initially infrastructure investment is critical, but then in the second phase, the countries need to open up to the world, not because they just need to export and import, but they need to open up to international ideas. Because right now, country is at a stage where it requires to import the best practices globally and infuse them. So the way to do it is to rely on foreign direct investment, especially high-tech FDI, which China benefited significantly. We don't need to go back in history. When we look at the successful phase of China, it very much starts with the phase where there were these special trade zones, special economic zones, where foreign companies came with their R&D labs, and they also utilized local talents as well. Because a lot of the people were trained in the US, in Europe, and 1 million Chinese students are coming back, and they are being hired by foreign companies in China to work for those companies. And that way they are learning and they are starting their own companies. And it's very interesting, actually. This spillover margin is extremely important because either foreign investment comes to your country, opens up the shop, and generates spillover on their workers who later on become entrepreneurs themselves, or China itself, through corporate venture capitals, invested in Silicon Valley and other startups around the globe and made them produce the technologies and learned from them. So we had a study on this. When we look at the Chinese investment through corporate venture capitals in foreign startups, after 4 or 5 years, China starts producing the same technology, starts patenting in the same area in China. So that's why these knowledge flow coming from FDI is extremely critical. And when we look at the Chinese patents, a big majority of the Chinese patents, when there were booms, Chinese patent booms, a lot of them came from foreign companies. So that's why it was extremely critical.
Hello, this is Shohnaz Yilmaz, the Dean of College of Administrative Science and Economics, Koç University. First of all, wholehearted congratulations to Daran Acemoğlu. We're all delighted by the news. It gave us some hope in these gloomy days. My question is for Ufuk. Ufuk Akçiğit, as one of our most outstanding graduates, who graduated from Koç and continued his career abroad in Chicago, I would like to hear from you about this gloomy picture you painted about the brain drain. We had students going abroad at the graduate level. Now it's coming down to undergraduate. In the next few years, it might come down all the way to high school level. Given the conditions that we're in, what would be your recommendations in the higher education sector? We also saw in the health sector, the picture is very dire and extremely worrisome as well. What would be your key recommendations, both to the sector and to the ones who are affecting it?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I already highlighted some of the arguments in my presentation. First, of course, the academic freedom is the #1 priority. But I think more important, or not more important, but another very important issue is that we need to move away, or countries, as they advance, they need to move away from horizontal education policies to more vertical education policies. And what do I mean by this? Of course, literacy and the basic education is needed for the whole population. But when it comes to higher education, especially for research universities, we cannot just distribute resources evenly across so many institutions across the country. Because then we are running thin in terms of the resources, and research requires resources. And talent requires reward and resources. And the way, for instance, US or all these frontiers are successfully designing their academic world is by rewarding the merit. Whoever proves themselves are generating both the financial returns and also research resources in terms of teaching reduction. So for instance, when I started at the University of Chicago, for 3 years, I barely taught any class. They asked me just to do research for 3 years. And I don't think any Turkish university can afford that. And what I was asked was to hire the next generation faculty members after I started at the University of Pennsylvania and then University of Chicago as a junior. I was in charge of hiring people into my department. I don't think any Turkish university would give the power of hiring to recent hired people. Of course, the presidents are willing to do the hirings, or it's a very centralized system. We need to definitely move away also from this centralized system, university system in Turkey. And the funding system is also significantly broken. The Korean example, I think it's a fantastic example. I was also in Korea with Shomik last month talking to Korean officials, and I wanted to talk specifically to academics and to that Korean Institute of Science and Technology, which was very essential in the early history of the Korean economy. So what Korea did is, when they initially wanted to start this economic boom in 1960, they brought 18 scientists, Korean scientists around the world to Korea, and the president wanted to pay them a salary that's higher than his own salary, just to signal how much he values science. And then they built the science center, which is now the most famous science center in Korea, that was built in 1960. And I was talking to the dean of that Korean Science and Technology Institute. She said that close to 70% of their budget is coming from private sector and the joint projects with the private sector. So this is a very different business model. This is such an integration of academic research with private sector business. And indeed, today there's a golden opportunity for this. Why? Because in the past, the gap between the basic science and company research was very wide. You write down the Carter equations and Maxwell equations, and they get published in academic journals, and some mad genius that turns into a radio and nylon, and then you start producing. It was a very lengthy process. Today, the gap between academic research and company research has really shortened. You write an academic paper on AI, the company can turn into a product in just a couple of weeks. But this is a golden opportunity. We really need to bring academic research and company research together. And for this, we need to have programs, and we need to also allow the private companies to get also closer to the firms. Switzerland is doing a fantastic job on this. Most of their subsidy programs goes through universities. Rather than directly subsidizing companies, they give the money to universities, and they give the money to companies only through universities, through their joint projects. And only through well-funded universities we can really, make it a place of attraction. Otherwise, they are not going to stay hungry. Academics, of course, they are all driven by their intellectual curiosity, but they also have some reality. They have kids at home who need to get education, and if they cannot offer them, good education, they are going to leave the country and do it somewhere else. So that's why we need to face this reality. We need to bring the academic freedom, but we need to also allow an environment where the young people can dream a future in the country and plan a family, a life, and especially for smart people, because they have a fantastic outside opportunity outside the country. And we need to keep them, and that can only happen if they are rewarded, but that will also happen if we have a strong industry that pays also good salaries to well-trained Turkish students, or those students who are trained in Turkey, basically. So that's why we have to have a holistic approach. It's not only an education problem, it's also an industry problem, and we need to consider this problem jointly, I think.
So the last question, and Mr. Romero as well, okay.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening, rewarding panel. Congratulations to Daron Hoca. I was recently, as part of a number of visits, visiting middle and high schools in Malatya and its ilçes last 3 days. I want to share one observation and ask you to travel a little bit further down the education chain from higher education to ilkokul, ortaokul level. The almost unanimous feeling of the teachers and the müdürs of these schools was that when I asked them, what's the number one problem you have? They said, it's reform fatigue. They said in our careers, which is generally, I'd say on the average it was between, let's say 12 to 17 years. They said curriculum changes all the time. Methods of teaching changes all the time. The textbooks change the time, and so on and so on. And the second question, which they are reluctant to talk about, is the position of teachers in the society and their remuneration. Without making teaching from the beginning of that chain a desired and looked up profession and paying them to live a decent life, does your suggestions at the highest level of academia, does it have a chance of success?
No, you're absolutely right. Of course, the education is not only the tertiary education, of course. So we need to recognize that education is the path for social mobility in the country. Indeed, we talked about turnover and creative destruction, but creative destruction doesn't happen only among firms. Creative destruction has to happen also among society, among people. We have to give equal opportunities to every kid in the society, and then whoever proves himself or herself should be able to rise up, and then we should reward them for their success. And I think, for that, for instance, Anadolu Sesi system or Parasız Yatılı system was extremely critical, because there the system was touching and finding the raw talent at a very early age, and I count myself among those. At the age of 11, I managed to take the Parasız Yatılı exam and moved from Karacabey to Ankara, and then my education journey started. When we push the exam system to age of 16, we are not testing raw talent anymore, and we are testing the neighborhood that the kid has grown up. And then we are basically creating, rich families are able to afford a better education for their kids. And then in Anatolia, we are losing a lot of potential, Daron Hocamoğlu's potentially, right? So that's why I think we need to really, I think everybody has an opinion on the education system. I don't need to go through the list. Of course, when I was a kid, being a high, teacher was a very prestigious thing. Indeed, my uncle was a teacher, and everybody during Bayrams was treating him like the god, and nobody else was being, asked how he's or she's doing first. But now, the status of teachers in the society has changed, but this is all also related to the financial compensation. Because if financial markets are just, rewarding people, and, if people think that they won't get rewarded, then we are making, people teachers who have other dreams. We need to bring people who have the ambition of becoming a teacher and wants to teach, and then we need to get them the right training to train our kids, and we need to also design the right system to select the right talents and rise up. So we need another reform. We talked about, teachers are complaining about reforms, but not every reform is in a positive direction, unfortunately.
Mr. Ömer Aras and then Cevdet Hoca are going to ask the final questions.
Okay. Professor Akçiğit, my question is for you, but I also have to congratulate Daron Hocamoğlu for this incredible success. Incredible success. My question is, when we look at the economies, we see that the majority of the gross domestic product in the US, in Europe, in all the developed countries is coming from services rather than manufacturing. Even in Korea, services bigger than manufacturing. And also in Turkey, that's the case. And we always talk about high technology and so on. Yes, we have to do that. But I think, don't we have to focus also very much on the services sector, such as healthcare? Because Turkey, as a logistically, has a big advantage in the healthcare industry, for example. Like in the Turkish Airlines, we're a hub, and I think Istanbul and Turkey can become a hub for the aging population in Europe and also in Middle East and so on. And healthcare doesn't mean only hospitals, it also has a lot of industries that is pulling because all the supplies of the healthcare and everything. So sectors like this should not, I mean, the states-owned enterprises should not be in the game, but the state should give some kind of a guidance or support for certain industries like healthcare or other services in Turkey. What do you think about
No, I agree with you. First of all, there was a question on aging. For aging, we need to have more productive production, basically. We need more automation, and that was one thing that I wanted to also mention while you were asking your question. It came to my mind that some people are very pessimistic about the automation, for instance, but in an aging population, those high-tech production facilities are particularly needed. I wanted to leave, this also. I wanted to mention that as well. Now, going back to the service question, every country should utilize its strong muscles, and that's why we need to do really a proper soul searching and identify where we are good at. Healthcare is definitely a sector where we are good at least in terms of its research. When we look at the number of publications, we have done very detailed studies on this. We prepared several reports on this. When we look at the Turkish publications, more than 50% of Turkish publications are coming in healthcare and medicine. But when we look at the manufacturing that's built around it, we have nothing, basically. No medical devices are being produced. Look at Costa Rica. Costa Rica is number one or number two in terms of the healthcare, care products export. Why Costa Rica? Why not Turkey? But somehow, I want to go back to what I mentioned. We have a strong muscle in academia. We have strong muscles and willing entrepreneurs and capital in industry, but we haven't managed to bring them successfully together. And somehow we've always treated this as a sin that academics, talking to private sector. That should be the complete opposite. And second thing, now we are going through AI revolution. And this provides another golden opportunity for countries, especially countries like Turkey, where if we can reform our education system and produce the right trained people, we can really, become an important player. So we had done one study where we looked at the number of theses that are being written in the US over time. Computer science was at the bottom in 1960s. Now it's number 2 in terms of the number of theses that are being written. So there's a major revolution, and you can see that the tsunami was coming. You look at just over the past 5 years, for instance, or 10 years, the number of theses that are being written in different fields. Business administration, history, religion, agriculture, computer science is number 10. Again, we are losing another opportunity. Without training people, we cannot just people to suddenly, create magics. Everything has to go through training first, of course. So that's why I think, the to-do list, we might disagree on some items maybe, but the overall to-do list, I think we will all agree on what needs to be done. And then it should be exercised afterwards.
So the final question is from Mr. Cevdet Akçay.
I have 2 questions, Ufuk. The first one's a technical one. The PRM graph that you had, PRM index graph, is cross-section, I guess. So if you treat it as panel data, does the ranking change, or is it more or less the same? Is it intact through time? I mean, Germany and Slovenia are low PRM countries. Were they always so, or did they change through time? From high PRM to low PRM, for example. Just out of curiosity, because even the cross-section seemed to involve some non-linearities man-wise to me. I was surprised by a number of countries, I mean, being placed at the two ends of the graph.
Yes, yes.
I mean,
So
you probably have the data. You might not
but
have
there are-
tried off the top of your head, but
Right. So some of those indicators are quite persistent, but there are countries that have changed their position significantly,
I
and
could
UK is probably the poster child on that. There has been at some point a major product market reform, and a lot of the researchers also use that as a variation in the data to study the impact of the policy, how it triggered innovation and productivity growth. UK was number one in the list, for instance. So some countries did some important homework, but in general, those rankings are pretty persistent over time.
okay. The second question is you can just answer yes or no.
Yeah.
It's a rhetorical question in Turkey, but I don't think it's rhetorical. It's deceptively simple. Is there a concept such as industrial policy?
So when it comes to industrial policy, I know this is a very catchy expression. I am a bit worried that it's being abused. And especially in the US, for instance, now, industrial policy is all over the place. But when I look at, and recently I wrote a piece for the IMF FND magazine, it came out a month ago, and I was criticizing exactly this. Because, people these days are very much in favor of industrial policy, but industrial policy based on what? It has to be based on evidence. And as long as, industrial policy rewards not size, but performance, then, I can be on board. But if industrial policy is designed based on some observables just because it makes the policy making easy, then it can be very, very dangerous. And I studied what happened in the US in 1980s. And in 1980s, there was a massive push for R&D tax credit. First time in 1981 at the federal level. At the state level in 1982, Minnesota was the first state to introduce it. And then more and more R&D benefits were offered. Which companies utilized it? Of course, the goal was to boost innovation across the country. But when you look at across the size distribution, it was the largest firms that utilized it. Okay, so then what happened? Market concentration went up significantly. Now, one of the top problems in the US right now is declining competition and declining dynamism. R&D investment used to be, private R&D relative to GDP used to be around 0.5% of GDP in 1980. Today, it's 2.5% of GDP. 5 times increase. What happened to productivity growth? Productivity slowed down during that time, if anything. So this type of industrial policy, I cannot say that this was a success. So that's why we cannot just come up with a generalized term industrial policy and then just go after it. As long as things are data-driven and I see evidence that this type of policy works, then I'm on board. So that's why in the WDR, we try to advocate that policy making has to be informed by data and analysis, rigorous analysis. Otherwise, it's just wishful thinking, and wishful thinking doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes.
Even based on data, I think prospective international competitiveness-wise, shaping industrial policy is borderline impossible if you ask me, because you should be reading your own country in a very efficient manner and your competitors with the same level of efficiency, which is, asking for the impossible in a way. So there are, I love your to-do list phrase, as you know. I think you have to stick to a to-do list. And one last remark about inflation. I mean, coming from central banker, that's, I think, expected. You said something about inflation, fine, and I'm raising hand, I'm upping the ante. Inflation is a time horizon killer. It's a time horizon destroyer. With no time horizon, all this basically stays up in the air, amounting to nothing, unfortunately. So for your efforts to be, or success, bear any fruit, we have to disinflate.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. It's a time horizon killer. Efficient allocation of resources, funds, impossible in high inflation, impossible.
Absolutely. No, I'm being very realistic on that. Number one problem right now in the country is by far inflation. Without having, stable inflation, people cannot see, the future, and then they cannot expect to have high returns. I should also conclude by saying that Daron Hoca was extremely influential for my career, but Cevdet Hoca was also extremely influential for my career. So two of my heroes, basically. So
It's been a historic day for all of us, so we once more congratulate Darona Cemoğlu, and thank you very much for your patience as well.